You're listening to MedX, the Medical Extrusion Podcast, presented by U.S. Extruders. Extrude with confidence. Custom extrusion equipment designed for you and your application.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the MedX Podcast. Today's guest is Jennifer Green, Senior Global Technical Business Development Manager at Lubrizol Advanced Materials. Today, we will talk about all things related to polyurethane for medical devices, including the backbone chemistry of polyurethane, material selection, and end applications. Enjoy. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome to the MedX Podcast.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me. Really glad for the opportunity.
Yeah, we saw each other at MPP Minnesota and had a little chat, and here we are doing a podcast together. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that event, Steve.
Thanks. I'm really excited about getting into a real technical conversation about polyurethane, the backbone chemistry, and some of the end-use medical device applications. So we'll get right into it. And we talked a little bit about MPP. And if you remember, one of the big themes of MPP Minnesota was design for manufacturability.
Mm-hmm.
We had extrusion people, molding people, talking about collaborating early. Whether you're a contract manufacturer working with an OEM to talk about form, fit, and function, tolerance levels. What we didn't really talk about at MPP related to that is getting the material supplier or the compounder involved up front, right? So I wanted to get your thoughts on that as it relates to DFM and design for manufacturability, getting the material supplier involved very upfront in those collaborative discussions.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Steve. It's something that we're really passionate about. Material properties are really going to drive a lot of the performance of devices together with processing, and they can also inform what processing methods can be used. So especially if you're looking at designing a brand new device with new or enhanced functionality, contacting the material supplier and as well as the compounder to try to talk about what is needed can be really, really helpful in differentiating your device performance.
Definitely. Let's kind of start with the chemistry, the backbone, hard and soft segments. If you can explain that theory for the audience related to polyurethane, that'll kind of set the stage for some of these discussions.
Sure. I know you've had a couple of guests on previously that talked about polyurethanes. I think Ajay did a really great overview of polyurethanes. They're an extremely versatile chemistry. The only really requirement for the material to be a polyurethane is that it's got an isocyanate reacted with an alcohol group. And a thermoplastic polyurethane is a material that can be melted and remelted, so it's not a cross-linked material. Really what's going to drive the performance of that polyurethane material is the selection of the type of isocyanate and the type of alcohol group, or hard segment and soft segment is what we call it. Mm-hmm. So the isocyanate section really drives the strength of the material and some of the chemical resistance performance. And the alcohol group, or we call it a soft segment or a polyol, is really going to drive many of those other properties. It gives it the flexibility. So selection of those chemistries can be really helpful in driving that performance.
Okay. I know we'll dig a little deeper into that, the hard segment, soft segment later. Mm-hmm. But as far as material selection for a modern catheter or delivery system, why would somebody choose, a device designer choose polyurethane over some of the other alternatives like a silicone or a thermoplastic elastomer like a PIBA, or even maybe a fluoropolymer, to kind of just give us, why select polyurethane
Sure.
for some of these applications.
Sure. Thermoplastic polyurethane, it's really known for being high strength with thin walls. So if you're comparing to a material like a silicone, which is great for softness and also for biostability, you can get a much thinner wall catheter by using a thermoplastic polyurethane without necessarily having to compromise on that softness or on that biostability. There's some other properties about thermoplastic polyurethane that might make it advantageous over an FEP or a PEBA material, depending on the application. Polyurethane has a really unique property in that its flexural modulus goes down when it's in the body. That's a consequence of disruption of some of the hydrogen bonding that occurs. We won't go too far into those details, but it does not impact the polymer's tensile strength as much as the flexural modulus. So you get this unique softening behavior. It tends to enhance patient comfort, especially in infusion catheters where you have that catheter is percutaneous to the skin and it's in place for a longer period of time. So that's one other reason why you might choose a TPU over an FEP.
Okay. So softening in the body. And what I heard you say is that softening effect, it does not affect the tensile strength though of the material.
It has a very minor effect on the tensile strength. Really, it's disrupting some hydrogen and van der Waals bonding between polymer chains. So it allows that material to flex, but you're not breaking polymer chains. So you still have that tensile strength. Okay.
Very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about, like I said, we're going to get into the chemistry a little bit more and the hard segments. I know there's aromatic, aliphatic. Aliphatic. Am I saying that right?
Aliphatic.
Aliphatic. I said it right, I think. So,
you said it right the first time.
Okay. Talk a little bit about the different types and then we can talk a little bit about the soft segment as well.
Sure. So traditionally, polyurethanes used in medical devices can have either an aromatic or an aliphatic isocyanate in the backbone. The aromatic isocyanate tends to give the material superior strength and chemical resistance. It basically stacks up better in terms of if you're talking about how the polymer chains behave. It allows better and tighter packing. So that's what gives it the strength and chemical resistance. With an aliphatic material, one of the main benefits is that it's a non-yellowing type of isocyanate. So you will maintain your clarity and your color much better, especially if you're planning on gamma sterilizing, for example, having exposure to radiation or UV light. The other thing to note about aliphatic is that it is a less tightly packed structure. So TPUs made of aliphatic isocyanate can actually soften more in the body, and you can see that as either a strength or a strength or a weakness, depending on the application.
Okay. Interesting. So the aliphatic is less prone to the yellowing with UV light.
Yes.
And the sterilization, that's interesting as well. Talk a little bit about the soft segment selection, especially for implant stability applications.
Sure. So soft segment selection is really important if you're talking about in-body applications for a long period of time. The soft segment is usually what is attacked first because the urethane bond is very chemically stable in the body. So typically what we're looking for is both resistance to hydrolysis, that's attacked by water, and especially for blood contacting applications, we're interested in what's called oxidative stability, meaning resistance to the body's tendency to want to get rid of any foreign material. So you want to prevent that attack by oxygen. You might hear people talk about polyether, polyester, and polycarbonate type soft segments in urethanes. And we do typically rank those in order of biostability, with the polycarbonate type soft segment being the most biostable to oxidative and hydrolytic attack, especially in blood, and the polyester type being the least stable especially to hydrolysis. The polyether material, that can be durometer and application dependent, and it depends essentially on how much polyether is in that material, which relates to the polymer hardness.
Can you kind of give me a highlight of a less than 30-day application, maybe like a PICC line versus a lead that's greater than 30 days in some of those characteristics that you mentioned?
Sure. So if we're talking about a polyether material, for example, and you'd really like to use that type of polyurethane in a long-term application, we would usually recommend staying with something on the short D or the harder scale for durometer. That will have more of the hard segment urethane component and less of the ether component. So essentially the surface of whatever device that you have is what's going to be attacked when it's implanted. And you want as much oxidative resistance functionality to be at that device surface to give it the best chance of survival of a really long-term blood contact. So materials or TPUs specifically with a high hard segment percentage tend to shield whatever minor ether content is present. So we're usually talking short D durometer for long-term applications with ethers. And with the polycarbonate based off segments, you do have more flexibility there for a softer material, higher polycarbonate content. And don't talk about polyesters typically for longer term applications.
Okay. That's interesting. So the short D polyurethanes typically more in the longer term, and the short A, when we talk about short A, what are we going down to, like 50, 75A? Is that
around like 65 to 75
okay.
for a 100% polyurethane material?
Okay.
Although I know we are going to talk about some application development, some material development later on that kind of goes opposite of some of those general rules with both biostability and the maximum softness you can get.
Okay. Can you also shed a little bit light on these different grades related to the different processing methods, molding, extrusion, and kind of a solution or dip coating application as well?
Sure. One of the good things about polyurethane is how versatile they are, but it also can make it challenging to pick the right grade for your processing method because there's so much variety available. There are grades, and we can formulate polyurethane specifically for extrusion, injection molding, and for solution processing. Usually for the extrusion and the injection molding, we're targeting viscosity ranges and how quickly that material is going to want to set up or recrystallize once it starts cooling. Usually you want that to be a quicker process for injection molding and a longer process for extrusion. So there's things we can do to influence the way that polymer backbone behaves to optimize. For solution processing, it's typically all about the ability of that polymer to dissolve in your selected solvent, which relates to the polymer chain length, as well as formulating any additive packages out that may not be soluble in the typical solvent. So we want to make a nice clear solution that has a consistent viscosity.
Okay. You know, of course, I'm an extrusion person and molding, but of the last couple of years, I've really been fascinated by that solution or coatings. In particular, some of the areas where we're coating stents or scaffolds. And in that arena, I've done a few podcasts in that area because it's so fascinating to me. There's different material solutions for the coating to make it less traumatic on the patient and for traction within the anatomy. And like expanded PTFE can be used, and it has natural porosity for cell growth, and then some of the fibers like a PET, but also polyurethane. And I'm wondering about kind of pores and permeability for cell growth and things like that, and a solution covering of a stent or a scaffold or any kind of medical device. If you can shed some light on that, it's very interesting to me.
Sure. It's fascinating to me as well, Steve. I think over the last 5 or more years, we've seen a real increase in interest in solution processable materials. For covering a kind of physical structure like a stent, polyurethanes can be used just to make a more biocompatible surface. Typically, a polyurethane won't be necessarily porous on its own, but the chemistry can be adjusted to allow for almost like a semi-permeability or selective permeability. So we have seen applications where an active ingredient, such as a pharmaceutical or an antimicrobial or something else, gets incorporated into the polyurethane. You don't have to add heat to put it in, so you can use some thermally labile materials, and then you can cast that over a stent. You can cast it as a film, or you can dip with it. Electrospinning is also an option, so it's a really interesting area to be working in.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about, you know, the covering for biocompatibility, but also the permeability for drug delivery or excipient. So that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Let's move on to some of the customization of polyurethane. We talked a little bit about it just now, but
Sure.
you know, why customize polyurethane? What are some of the additives and fillers that are used for functional reasons?
Sure. So the main reason to customize a polyurethane is really to achieve an application-specific goal. Some of the most common customizations we see, and this is something that Lubrizol can do internally by working directly with the OEMs or device designers, but compounders can help with some of this as well. We see addition of radial pacifiers like barium sulfate, like tungsten. That's extremely common for seeing the material or the device under X-ray. Addition of some additives such as lubricants. Some of the TPUs, especially the soft ones, can have some tack and be challenging in extrusion, and especially if you're thinking about a thin-walled extrusion. So some of the compounders offer some really interesting additives to try to reduce that tack. And then we also think about more application-specific things, like how do we improve the biocompatibility of the materials that's very application-specific, like thrombosis resistance, antimicrobial resistance. So a lot of really interesting topics there.
Can you dig a little deeper into the antimicrobial aspect?
There's a lot of different, or I should say a few different additives out there that are commercially available that can be added to polyurethanes. There's also some interest in developing materials, some of our own technology that our team works on. Some things to keep in mind is that antimicrobial is a pretty broad way of talking about things. So you really need to define what's meant by antimicrobial and then kind of go from there with the material development.
Okay. I lost my train of thought, but there was another something else I wanted to ask you, and it's related to tack. And you mentioned about it could be kind of problematic, but the modifiers or additives to reduce tack can certainly be a processing aid during extrusion because they don't hang up on things. And when I see really good extrusion engineers get excited about new extrusions they're doing, it's usually related to some thinner wall, larger diameter, and which is challenging as you get a larger diameter, thinner wall. But throw on a low durometer polyurethane, and then it's even more challenging because of the tackiness. So that certainly helps that area. We see a lot of that in like the structural heart applications, the larger 24 French, 30 French, larger diameter extrusions from TPU and some of the other soft materials. But I assume that the modification to reduce the tack really helps out the extrusion folks during the process.
Yeah, and that's definitely the intention with adding those additives. One thing to keep in mind, though, with including additional lubricants, it's great to reduce the tack. The way that those lubricants typically work is they position themselves at the surface of the component. So you do have to keep in mind that it is a balance between getting that tack reduction and any secondary other processes you may need to do, like bonding, printing. That lubricant can interfere with those processes, and also considerations around biocompatibility and any extractable components too. So we like to do the lubricants, but we also think about what do we do to the polymer itself to make it set up more quickly, to be inherently less tacky, to be easier to work with, so that those additives can be minimized to minimize complications with the rest of the device assembly.
That's a great point. It might help you during the extrusion process because it's not going to hang up on guide rollers and such, but it could, because it goes to the surface, it could affect secondary bonding and other applications. Earlier, I asked you about the effect of tensile strength when in the body and softening. Kind of the same question as we're adding lubricants that migrate to the surface for low tack. Does that have any impact on the mechanical properties, or is it such a low level of loading that it's negligible?
Usually they would be included at a pretty low level, so we wouldn't expect any impact on physical properties. But depending on how much goes in, I'd say if you're getting above the 2 to 5% mark, you may want to verify you're still getting the physical performance that you need.
Okay. But before we started the podcast, we talked a little bit about controlling some of these properties in the backbone of the material. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into permeability and drug delivery potential, if you can touch on that as well.
Sure. So drug delivery with polyurethanes, they can be used as a matrix where the drug is mixed in with the polyurethane. We talked a little bit about that with the solution processing. They can also be used as kind of a rate controlling membrane. And one strategy is to modify the hydrophobic nature of the polyurethane, specifically to work with a certain API. And that's something that we do have some experience with. But it is very application. Again, everything's application and drug dependent.
Okay. Speaking of applications, let's talk about a couple applications. Sure. And one of the applications that I get excited about a lot of this stuff, extrusion materials, but one area is balloons. Compliant balloons, semi-compliant balloons, and non-compliant balloons. And in this case, for polyurethane, ultra-compliant balloons, right? Soft, low pressure for occlusion or for sealing. Can you talk a little bit about that application? I think that's more of a dip type solution type application. You just shed some light on compliant balloons for medtech from polyurethane.
Sure. Yeah, we have seen polyurethanes be a material of interest for compliant balloons. And you're right, Steve, dip molding is one way to do that. Usually someone would pick a polyurethane over a silicone, for example, if the rest of their device, they have to attach that balloon to something. Mm-hmm. So if the rest of their device incorporates a thermoplastic, polyurethane is great because it can be dip cast to get that really thin wall, unique geometry, but then it can be thermally welded or solvent welded to the rest of the device.
That makes sense. So the rest of the device, a catheter shaft, usually a composite catheter shaft, multi-durometer with a stiffer material like a nylon 12 on the proximal. And as we go distally, we maybe have some different grades of PIBA or polyurethane, but typically on the tip, if we really want a less traumatic catheter or delivery system, polyurethane, a low durometer. Talk a little bit about some of the ultra soft applications for tips, for instance.
Sure. Neurovascular is a pretty common one where you want to have that catheter be as small as possible, go as far into the capillaries as possible, and be as atraumatic as possible. So polyurethane is amazing because it maintains its strength at very thin wall, which gives you a functional, very low flex modulus with that tip component. There's also a lot of TPEs used in that space, which are great materials for that as well. Where polyurethane can have an advantage is it typically is stronger than a TPE because it's a singular material. So we think there could be some advantages there around design flexibility by using a soft but still very tensily strong material.
And kind of the tip, not only a real soft, atraumatic material, but we talked earlier about radiopacity, adding tungsten or barium, and no issues with with adding loadings up to 20% or whatever with some of these radiopaque fillers?
TPUs I've seen up to 60% with barium, and even higher than that, up to 80 or 90% by weight with tungsten, which is a little bit cheating because of the density of tungsten.
Yeah.
So they can be filled. The compounders in the space are very competent with doing that. The thing to keep in mind, as you increase the amount of your radiopaque filler, it can increase the modulus of the material because you're putting in an organic into it. So it's a balance.
Okay. Are there any, you think I'm going to talk about PFAS in a minute, but
sure,
kind of wrap things up, but just kind of wondering, next generation. And when we say next generation in materials for medical, it takes a long time for regulatory for surgeon. Yeah. This is not like next year, next couple of years. This is like 5-10 years out. But are there unmet needs in medical and med tech where you see potential solutions with polyurethanes, modified polyurethanes, or with additives or such? Just want to kind of get your thoughts, kind of next gen stuff.
Sure. Steve, we really develop new materials for medtech in 3 main platforms. We look at enhancing biocompatibility of materials. So we talked a little bit about surface characteristics. Can we make that polyurethane surface biocompatible in a specific part of the body for a specific function? We want to talk about enhancing the biostability as well, making a polyurethane that can be biostable in blood that's not tied to its durometer. So can we decouple that so you can have both a very soft and extremely biostable long-term implant type material? And then the third area we develop under is mechanical properties. So we talked about ultra soft. We've also worked on materials that are intended not to soften and everything in between. So we really want to tailor that material performance to the application needs.
Okay. One other thought that I was talking about a composite catheter shaft where proximally you have a stiff, maybe a nylon, and maybe multi-durometer PBAs, and kind of finish off with a ultra soft TPU. But I'm thinking in my head, well, polyurethane has that durometer range pretty much, right? Why are there not on these catheter shafts, except for like a PICC line? I'm talking about a composite catheter.
Like a interventional navigational type
structural
catheter.
heart, exactly. Just kind of curious, are there multi-durometer applications for polyurethane as well in a composite structure like that?
We think that there are, Stephen. We've seen some specialty applications that do use multi-durometer polyurethanes. PBAs are very popular in the space and they perform really well. One major difference in the performance between TPUs and PBAs is that inherent softening that TPU does, which is great for infusion catheters, not so great if you want to predict the navigation and pushability and torqueability of a catheter. But we are seeing the technologies for embedding coils and braids and other support structures make that less important in some designs. So we think that it's definitely open, and it may be application driven as well.
Okay. Very interesting. Let's kind of wrap things up. One of the big topics in medtech all over the world is PFAS and potential PFAS regulations for fluoropolymers. And, there's a lot of folks that are actively looking at alternatives to PTFE as the inner liner of a catheter. I think PTFE, some of the properties, right, are unmatched, right? So it's hard to replace it. But nevertheless, medical device OEMs are kind of looking forward to, hey, we need to have maybe a backup plan here, right? And we know how long these things take. So not specifically as a PTFE replacement, just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on PFAS and kind of long-term implications or opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It's a huge topic. It's a broad topic. And it is an area where we think polyurethanes do have an opportunity to address maybe not all of the PTFE benefits in one material, but address the most critical ones. So, like, for example, we know that lubricity is a really big reason why med device designers use PTFE. So it's definitely an area of interest for us, and we actually love to talk to some application owners about specific needs.
Okay, excellent. Jennifer, this has been great discussion. I really appreciate you coming on. This has been informative.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. It's been fun.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for listening to MEDX, the Medical Extrusion Podcast, presented by US Extruders. Please subscribe to make sure you're getting the latest episodes. For video episodes, go to us-extruders.com/podcasts. All links are available in the show notes.